Chapter 12 of The Boy Scouts in the Maine Woods. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Boy Scouts in the Maine Woods by Herbert Carter. Brought to bay by wolves. "Oh, how awfully queer them howls seem, Tad," remarked Step Hen presently, just as the patrol leader expected he would; for he had a pretty good idea as to what was just passing in the mind of the tenderfoot. "Well, they do sound different somehow, from what they did when we were sitting around the cheery camp fire, listening to stories told by the guides," Thad admitted. "But then, wolves as a rule are cowardly brutes. They may do a heap of howling, but they seldom show any bravery. Only when in packs are they feared by hunters, away up in the frozen up parts of Canada, I'm told." "But say, don't you think there's a pack around here right now?" demanded Step Hen, apprehensively. "What makes you ask that?" the other questioned. "Why, in the first place, old Eli told us they never came away down here unless in numbers; and then again, Thad, didn't you notice that when one gave tongue over yonder to the right, a second answered him back from the left, and by jinks! Listen to that, would you? A third and a fourth, as sure as you live. Say, they're all around us, Thad. They've got us surrounded." "Let 'em surround, if it does 'em any good," laughed the other; and if he felt the slightest bit of uneasiness himself on account of those wolfish howls, Thad at least managed to conceal it, because he knew Step Hen was feeling creepy enough as it was, without having his alarm augmented by seeing his companion concerned. "But don't you think they might be able to pull us down just by force of numbers, Thad?" the other went on. "Oh, there can't be any such bunch of the cowardly brutes around as all that, I guess, Step Hen. And don't forget, please, that we're armed with weapons calculated to knock the spots out of any gray sneak that ever tried to steal venison won by two husky hunters. Think how you have 6 bullets in that little gun of yours, and each one ought to count for a wolf if it came to the worst." "Oh, there's where I was a fool," said Step Hen in a disgusted tone. "What's that?" demanded his chum, stopping short. "Why, I never stuck a blessed cartridge in my pocket, you see. Thought the 6 I had in the magazine of the gun would be good and plenty for all the needs I'd run up against. Now I wish I had the whole 100 along. Just my luck. I'm always losing things, and if it ain't anything else, it must be chances. Think of 100 dead wolves, and all killed with this great little gun, while I sat perched up in the crotch of a nice tree. It makes me sick to think of it, that's what, Thad." "Are you sure you did put 6 cartridges in the magazine before we left?" asked the other. "Well, that's what I meant to do, and I reckon I did, all right. Though Giraffe was joking me at the time, and he might have upset my calculations," Step Hen admitted. "Well, then, suppose you drop your bundle of meat, and take a look," advised Thad. "If it gets to warm quarters, it's just as well that you know how many wolves you can account for. Throw them out in 1, 2, 3 order now." So Step Hen began working the mechanism of his little gun. Not being excited, he was able to do this excellently. With the first cast, a cartridge flew out of the rejecting opening; but when he tried to repeat, nothing happened. He looked at the gun blankly, and tried twice more, but with the same result. "No use," remarked Thad, grimly. "Nothing doing, it seems. When you thought you put 6 cartridges in the magazine, you stopped at 3. And just such little mistakes have cost many a hunter his life before now, let me tell you, Step Hen." "Oh, mercy, what do you mean, Thad?" asked the other, alarmed. "Why, suppose now, several wolves were rushing at you with open mouths, and when you stood there, feeling able to take care of them all, your gun missed fire. Not because it went back on you, but through your silly fault in not making sure it was fed to the limit when you started. Things would look kind of gloomy just then, wouldn't they?" "I'll never go out without being dead sure my magazine is plumb full, and a handful in my pocket besides, catch me again," said Step Hen, solemnly. "That's a good resolution to make, and see to it that you remember it. But all the same, my boy, it isn't helping us any just now. You've got 1 bullet, and I advise you to hang on to that to the bitter end. Let me do most of the shooting, if it ever comes to it, which I hope it won't, because I've got a belt full of all sorts of shells, from buckshot to No. 7s. Now, shall we go on again?" "Sure," replied Step Hen cheerfully. But when he had managed to get his arms through the loops of his bundle, and began to heave it up on his back, he groaned audibly, so that Thad knew full well they would hardly make camp that night, at least not without several rests by the way. "How far do you think it is, Thad?" asked Step Hen a few minutes later, as he dragged along behind the other. "Well, I just can't tell," replied Thad. "It may be only 3 miles, and then again perhaps it would tally up twice that. We're going to strike the lake shore by keeping on as we are, but just how far away from camp gets me. Like as not, we can sight their fire, and give the boys a hail that will fetch a canoe for us." "Whee! Wish that blessed canoe was here right now," murmured poor Step Hen. "You're pretty near at the end of your rope, ain't you?" asked Thad. "That's right. I acknowledge the corn, Thad. I never was so dead tired in all my life. But I've still got the grit to keep along as far as I can put one foot in front of the other." "Good for you. We'll try it a little further and see," Thad went on. He was chuckling to himself, even while he spoke; for he knew full well that, although it pleased the tenderfoot to call it grit, in truth it was fear of those lurking, howling wolves that was driving Step Hen to making these astonishing efforts. After all, there is absolutely nothing like fear to make a laggard run like a Marathon sprinter. It has even effected cures in people supposed to be paralyzed, as Thad remembered reading not a great while before. They continued on for some time longer, but from the increasing puffing and grunting that came from the region where Step Hen was staggering along, it was evident that he was about ready to give up. "Thad!" he gasped presently. "Yes, what is it, Step Hen?" "Here's a tree," remarked the other. "I mean one that's got limbs near the ground, and not like these other tall ghostly pines that I'd need a lineman's spurs to shin up." Thad stopped for a minute. "Well, if you can't walk any further, Step Hen, say so, and I'll get up something that ought to keep the wolves away. But of course, if you're ready to call quits, why, I suppose we'll have to climb up here, and squat like a couple of owls all night." The prospect evidently did not please Step Hen any too well. Besides, he still retained a shred of his former pride. So he bristled up as he made answer, saying: "Why, of course I can go on for quite a distance yet, if you think there's any use of it, Thad. Now, what was you going to do, you said?" "Under this pine tree, you see, that's been badly used in some storm, there are a lot of branches lying. We can knock off a couple of the ones that look like they might burn pretty well, and use them for torches. Let's get busy, and see if it'll work." At any rate, it gave Step Hen another chance to rest up and get his breath. He still clung to that heavy deer's head with its antlers. Step Hen could be a most obstinate fellow when he chose, and having once made up his mind, it was like trying to move the Rock of Gibraltar to change it. After considerable effort, and the wasting of many matches, so as to get the pine cones and needles started into a blaze, on account of the night wind that kept blowing them out as fast as Step Hen lighted them, the torches were finally made an accomplished fact. "Wave it around some more, and the wind is going to keep it going," advised Thad. "Besides, the swinging motion will warn the wolves to keep away, if they don't want to get their old hides singed. Now, if you're feeling fit, we'll make another stab at getting over the ground." Still, Thad knew they would not go far before something else would happen; and he really expected that sooner or later they would have to do battle with the hungry 4-footed denizens of the pine woods that had scented their fresh meat, and gave signs of meaning to possess some of it, no matter at what cost. So Thad bent his mind on figuring out what they had better do if it came down to a halt. He knew that once they went into camp they could build several fires so as to virtually surround themselves with a circle of flames, across which no wolf that ever lived would have the daring to jump. And consequently Thad did not feel so deeply concerned about how things would come out as his comrade did. "Did you hear that? And wasn't it a nasty snarl, though?" demanded Step Hen, after possibly 5 minutes more had passed. "Yes, I heard it, and I suppose the beasts are closing in now," Thad replied. "Closing in? Oh, my gracious! Tad, we had ought to be finding a good tree like that Jim Dandy one I wanted to climb when you said no. These torches ain't a-going to last much longer, and I don't believe the critters care about 'em anyway. Hadn't we better change the program, Tad?" "Well, one thing I object to," the other answered. "After going to all this trouble to get venison, and losing our first deer to those woods pirates, I don't feel like letting these measly wolves share in this second lot." "Them's my sentiments exactly, Tad. But tell me how we're agoin' to prevent 'em, won't you? If it comes right down to brass tacks, we've just got to think of saving our own lives first of all, and let the precious meat go. But then, if we found a tree, we might hang it up before climbing among the branches ourselves. Then, while they were jumping and trying to snatch it down, we could be peppering the bunch like fun." "Leave it to me, Step Hen. I've got a plan worth two of that; though we might as well stop under this tree to try out; and if it comes to the worst, we can climb up. But I don't think it's going to be necessary. Throw down your bundle, now, and get busy. We're going to have a fire, 2, 3 of 'em, and squatting in the middle of the string, we'll just cook us some of this tender young buck, and snap our fingers at Mr. Wolf. If he gets too brash, why, we'll give him a card with our compliments. Hurry up and get a fire going, while I stand guard over you, Step Hen." End of Chapter 12. Recording by D.R. Baker Robinson.